Thanks. Okay, good. So, when you introduce me, I want to say your name right. How do you say your name?
My name is Jehu.
Jehu.
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess the people break it without a signal. As soon as they go on, yeah, maybe right there. I mean, they can pick them up. We'll keep an eye out for folks that tickets are fine. Yeah. I'll kind of keep an eye out. Hand them. Okay, we're gonna let you keep that ticket as a souvenir. How about that? That's a deal, isn't it? Okay, we might put Ross on further. Oh, you got it, that one. Yeah, people come in. Try it. You see him in the program. Okay, we're going to try to be punctual this evening. Good evening, everybody. Is everybody happy today? Good. Well, a few people left. They're in my principal's classes. That's what I like to say. I'm Dan Keister. I'm the faculty advisor of the Economics Club and director of undergraduate studies. And we want to welcome everyone to, I think, the 7th annual. And actually, we do this twice a year occasionally, but we've gone back to once a year. Economics Club series, speaker series on economic prosperity. Before we get started, we have a two-sided program. Hopefully, everybody picked up. And we kind of want you to look at that a little bit. For one of our officers is still coming from class, Paige, I believe, unless I missed her coming in. But she should be here momentarily. And Jehu and Tori, I know, are here. Piper, I think, is going to get here as quickly as she can also. But we've had a really great group of Econ Club officers this year. And we're excited about things that we're doing throughout the academic year. Everyone here is invited to come back exactly 1 week from tonight, same time, same place. It's probably going to be more geared toward the undergraduates as Mike Oldfather, emeritus faculty here at K-State, presents to the Econ Club about his guide to personal finance. And it's really great advice for students to hear. At that time, we'll have a more traditional Econ Club meeting. Those of you that come to most of our meetings know we usually talk about ODE, Omicron Delta Epsilon, and joining that. We're going to get that rolling pretty soon. Our field trip to Washington, D.C., April, I believe, 9th through the 11th, which, and here's Paige, our vice president's here, actually. I'm going to put you to work, so why don't you sit over here, actually. I have something to talk to you about. And so we have that field trip coming up, April 9th through the 11th. Some students are going to be participating in the Economic Scholars Program at the Dallas Fed at the end of March. Just a lot of really neat things we have coming up. And stay tuned and try to reach out to either our Facebook page or our listserv, because what we're going to be doing, come on in, Frank, you're good. What we're going to be doing is having our annual debate, also underwritten by the Fred and Mary Koch Foundation. At least that's the plan for April/May. And the topic's going to be the Affordable Care Act. We've been working on our speakers, and we have some really exciting ideas that we're hoping to come to fruition for that event. So this is not our last big public event of the year, and the Econ Club has been extremely active. You can see here we have a list of extremely prestigious speakers that have been here in the past for this series, and it's really been a lot of fun. And once again, I just want to publicly thank the Fred and Mary Koch Foundation for making this possible, because they not only underwrite this speaker series, but they're helping us fund our student field trip to DC. They're helping fund the student trip to Dallas to participate in the Economic Scholars Program. So they've been extremely generous with our undergraduate program, and we're really excited about the things we have coming up. So as I mentioned, we have a really great set of Econ Club officers. And what's really great is one of my jobs, along with Crystal, who does 98% of it, and I want to thank her publicly, Crystal Strauss, is putting this program together. And I was trying to narrow down David's accomplishments where we could fit it on the page. And it wasn't particularly easy, but we summarized things as best we could. He had a really productive discussion earlier today with some of our undergraduates. And one of the things that came up in the discussion is every year when the Nobel Prize is issued to an economist, David writes the synopsis for the Wall Street Journal almost every year. And he can get into the details on that if he wants to, about the exceptions of that rule. But that's just, one of a variety of professional journals, and then publicly accessible topics that he's written about and spoke about and been extremely well received at. So we're really pleased to have a speaker of such great stature. But again, I don't get to do the formal introduction of our speaker. That's our Econ Club president's job. So I'm going to turn it over to Jehu.
Hello, everybody. How everybody's doing? So it's my job to give an introduction to Dr. David Henderson. It's certainly not an easy job to do because of all the accomplishment that he has. So Dr. David Henderson is a research fellow with the Hoover Institution at Stanford. It's also a professor of economics. And his field of research is public policy, and his specialty is in making economic issues and analysis easy and interesting for the public audience to understand and relate to. And he has been writing for the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Cato Journal, and many other prestigious journals. So tonight, he's going to talk about economic inequalities, the popular misconception, and the most important facts. So K-State Economic Clubs, let us welcome the Purple Way, Dr. David Henderson.
Thank you. David, I apologize. And if people are thinking about their schedule this evening, we are having a post-discussion reception at Wahoo. If anyone's interested in coming, I think we're all welcome. It seems like a very nice group. So please see Jay or myself or any one of the officers. Tori, who will be our mic person, and Nate.
Thank you for that introduction, Jehu. First of all, can everyone hear me? Okay. I've received a lot of hospitality. I flew all day yesterday. I flew 3 flights to get here from California. And so I did a lot of traveling in Kansas, which leads me to my first question. What do I have in common with a Jayhawk player back earlier this month? We both traveled in Kansas. So I want to just tell you a few things about my background. I'll get through them very quickly because both Dan and Jehu did a great job. This is probably what I'm most likely to be remembered for if I flew in a flight and crashed tomorrow, which I plan not to. This thing is available. By the way, the individual articles are available online for free on econlib.org. I was the senior economist for energy policy with President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. And this is me with this guy, try to figure out who's who here. And who here has heard of Milton Friedman? All right. So the guy on the left is Milton Friedman, the bald guy. And the guy with his arms crossed with that wonderfully color-coordinated outfit is me. Whoops. Back. I know I don't want to give away this. So there are two big issues that have come along in recent years: income inequality and wealth inequality. They're not the same thing. I'm going to talk about both. But the people who worry about income inequality usually worry about wealth inequality and vice versa. So I am going to talk about both. Now, the interesting thing is people have little idea where they are in the income distribution. So let me just show you a couple of facts from a survey of people across various developed countries. An average of 7% of respondents owned a car and a second home, yet on average 57% of this group thought they belonged in the bottom half of the income distribution. If you own a second home, the odds are you don't. Among low-income respondents receiving government aid, a majority placed themselves above the bottom 20% of their income distribution. So people in the bottom 20% actually thought they were higher. In a way, that's good news, right? Because they feel like they're doing all right. Moreover, another pair of scholars found that no matter which country they studied, few people think they're poor, and almost no one thinks they're rich. And one of my messages tonight is most Americans don't think they're poor, and they're right. Most Americans don't think they're rich, and they're wrong. You're rich, and we'll see why. Who here has heard of the book Capital in the 21st Century by Piketty? It made a big splash, and you might think, well, that's why all this interest in inequality, because he wrote at length about that. I don't think that's it. I think he was tapping into something people already believed, and here's my evidence. There's a math professor at University of Wisconsin named Jordan Ellenberg who checked the 5 passages of Piketty's book that were most highlighted on Kindle. The book is almost 700 pages long. I've read all of it, including the footnotes, to do a review of it. However, the last of the 5 most marked passages was on page 26. So it seems people were reading up to about page 26. So it was more confirming what they wanted to believe. It wasn't that they looked at all his arguments and evidence. So I want to address 2 issues, an important philosophical question. Does it matter how people acquire their wealth? And I want to address some factual issues. There we are. Here are the factual issues. Has income inequality increased in the United States? Has income inequality increased in the world? Where are you in the income distribution? Where do you fit in the world? Are increased income inequality and increased poverty the same thing? What has happened to economic well-being in the United States over the last century or so? What is the role of work in explaining income inequality? What is the role of age in explaining wealth inequality? We'll see those are very big roles. And what are people's objections to inequality, and what are my answers to those objections? And finally, I'm going to touch briefly on government policies that we could implement that would reduce inequality, reduce the role of government, and increase the well-being of those at the bottom. Let me now turn to the philosophical issue. When are large differences in wealth justified? And I want to tell the tale of 2 fortunes, what I call the earner and the taker. These are both true stories. First of all, this is tempting me, and I'm going to mess myself up with that. Let me go here. This is what the person I call the chainsaw innovator. This is a guy named McCullough, Robert McCullough, who was the first person to produce a very light 25-pound one-person chainsaw in the late 1940s. His chainsaw revolutionized wood cutting. I have a friend, he's an older economist in his 80s. His father had a big house. He was responsible for cutting the wood to heat this house in the winter. He saved his allowance as a teenager so he could go out and buy that chainsaw. And it just dramatically changed his life. He actually had a fun summer instead of a rotten summer. Now, McCullough made a lot of money. He sold over 100,000 of these chainsaws. He made a lot of money. However, who else gained? This is an economics audience. Who gains?
People
Bingo. Or even people who cut it as a hobby, right? It is consumers' gain. And the measure of their gain is we call consumer surplus, the difference between the maximum they're willing to pay and the amount they do pay. So he gains and they gain. Now, he gains a lot. He gains millions. They gain in consumer surplus maybe $50 each, which was a lot of money back then. So what happens to inequality, income inequality? If he's gaining a lot and they're gaining a little, it goes up. So then my question is that a problem? And I want to just let that sit with you. And by the way, that's not the end of the story. He comes along, he produces the chainsaw, he makes people's lives better, he charges a very hefty price for it, but then what happens next? Other people come along and compete and produce other chainsaws and bring the price down, so consumers gain even more. How much do innovators in this economy usually gain? The answer might surprise you. An economist at Yale, William Nordhaus, estimated that on average, only 2.2% of the total present value, the stream of income, the stream of benefit of social returns to innovation are captured by innovators. The rest goes to other people, mainly consumers. So he's gaining a small percent of a very large number. That's the chainsaw innovator. Now consider the case of the privilege seeker, the taker. The second story is of someone with very modest income and wealth who became a US congressman in the 1930s, and he used his position in Congress to benefit his wife and himself. There was a radio station in Austin, Texas in the late 1930s. The owners were trying to sell it. The Federal Communications Commission, the regulator, wouldn't give them permission. This congressman helped protect the budget of the Federal Communications Commission. There was a fight in Congress, and he said, I'll support you guys and make sure you get your budget. This official in the Federal Communications Commission felt he owed him a favor, so he said, why don't you ask your wife to apply to buy the station? And he said, that's a good idea. So she bought the station for $17,500, and the people suddenly were allowed to sell it. They'd been trying to sell it for 3 years. They got permission within a couple of weeks. Once she got the station, she applied to get longer hours. You actually couldn't do your radio station 24 hours back then. She got longer hours, and she got a better place on the radio spectrum without paying anything extra. When she applied for that, she got permission within a month. By the time this man became US president, his net worth was $14 million in 1964, and over half of that net worth was due to that radio station. He told people when it came up during the 1964 presidential campaign that his wife worked really hard. That's why they had all this wealth. No, he worked hard at getting this license. So he and his wife went from being a middle income, middle wealth couple to being a very, very, very wealthy couple. $14 million in 1964 is like $70 million today. So here we have two examples in which income and wealth inequality increased. One because a man introduced a product that was a better product than what was out there, and the other because a man used his influence in the political system to get a special privilege from a government agency. And by the way, after he got that special privilege, the FCC made it very hard for other radio stations to compete with him in Austin. So what happened to inequality there? It also increased. And so the question is, should we think differently about those two cases? And let me ask you, who thinks we should think differently about those two cases? Raise your hand if you do. Who thinks we shouldn't think differently about those two cases? Raise your hand. Okay, couple. Well, I think we should for two reasons. The less important reason is that McCullough's actions made not just himself, but hundreds of thousands of consumers better off. And Lyndon Johnson's and his wife's actions did not clearly make other people better off. But what's responsible for that less important reason is the more important reason. The increase in real income to McCullough's customers happened because of a voluntary transaction in the marketplace. The increase in wealth to LBJ and his wife came not due to market transactions per se, but due to his use of raw political power. And now I want to show you an extreme case of the taker, a guy who died just recently. He was in the top 0.001% in Cuba. Anyone recognize who it is? Fidel Castro. And here was the place he went to get away, his little hideaway. He was very well off. By the way, he often spoke for hours to a captive audience, literally a captive audience. You're not a captive audience. I recognize that. His longest speech was 12 hours. Mine is going to be no more than 8% of that. Now I want to get to some of the facts. Has income inequality increased in the United States? The answer seems obvious, yes. But the answer, well, you'll see, well, let's look at the data. If you look just at change in income from 1979 to 2007 based on tax units, unadjusted market income, this is what people are actually making in the market. Income inequality has increased dramatically. This is the second column from the left, the change in income, where they lost 33%. That looks horrible because they're already starting from a low level. Richest 20%, 32.7% did very well. But that's market income. It turns out there's a huge amount of welfare, food stamps, welfare, Medicaid, housing assistance, and so on, that goes to people in that situation. So look at the middle one, the change in income over that same time, where the poorest 20% gained 31.8, which is pretty nice. This is in real terms. The richest still gained more. So yes, inequality went up, but everyone was doing a lot better. And then if we include capital gains, realized capital gains, the poorest 20% were doing better, and the richest 20% were doing even better. So everyone was gaining. So yes, inequality was going up, but this first column where it shows minus 33% is highly misleading. So, what about worldwide inequality? Here the answer is clear-cut. And I call this story the elephant in the world. You know, the elephant in the room, this is the elephant in the world. This graph takes a little explanation. On the horizontal axis is the percentile of the global income distribution. So people on the left are way at the bottom of the global income distribution. This is the poorest people in India. People on the right, between whoa, what did I do? This is sensitive. People on the right, between 95 and 100, us, basically. So, and then the vertical axis is the real income growth in those 20 years from 1988 to 2008. And what do you see? What you see is the biggest growth was at the bottom end. And that's why I call it the elephant in the room. If you look, it's kind of like an elephant with its trunk going up at the right-hand side. So that's really good news. If you care about people in very poor countries, that's really good news. Also, it's important, oops, I don't have a slide for that. Let me just say something. No, I do have a slide for that. You might wonder, where are you? Let's say you're in the United States, which you are, and you have an income of $20,000. Or $30,000, or $50,000, or $80,000, or $100,000. I'm guessing, I don't know. Now, 20 sounds relatively low, right? I mean, some of you are looking for jobs, and you're probably planning to make like at least 15 an hour, and 2,000 hour work year, that's 30. So 20 sounds really low, right? We have agreement on that? Well, let's see where you would be in the world income distribution if you had 20. you would be in the top 3.65%. If you had 30, you'd be in the top 1%. The Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street ought to be protesting themselves. If you had 50, you're in the top 3%. If you have 80, you're in the top 10th of a percent. If you have 100, you're doing even better. So that's really important to realize that's, we're doing well. And I'm going to look at that in more detail in a few minutes. Also, it's important not to forget income mobility. When we're looking at people in these quintiles, or we're looking at people, we're taking a snapshot. If we take the snapshot of the people in the lowest quintile 5 years later, many of them are different people. There's a life cycle to income. So you will have disproportionately represented in the lowest quintile people who dropped out of high school and are just starting to work. Even high school dropouts, if you fast forward 10 years and they've acquired some skills, and if they've got married and stayed married, that's the key, will not typically be in the bottom fifth. They'll be in the second or third. By the way, if a different talk I give, maybe the personal finance guy is going to do this, is how to get rich. One of the rules that surprises people, you're breaking it, is get married and stay married. Okay. So, has increased income inequality meant increased poverty? My mother was quite a singer. She loved going around the house singing. And there was a song she sang, and I'm going to sing it to you. There's nothing surer. The rich get rich and the poor get poorer. Sound familiar? Well, if we want to have it be accurate, we should change the song. There's nothing surer. The rich get rich and the poor get richer. Doesn't quite rhyme, but I'll take accuracy over rhyme any day. But even bona fide economists often mess up the distinction between increased inequality and increased poverty. Economist Mark Thoma recently wrote, recent research from UCLA's Fielding School of Public Health provides evidence that income inequality is associated with inequality in health. In particular, lower income is associated with high levels of stress, exhaustion, cardiovascular disease, lower life expectancy, and obesity. What did he just do? He starts by talking about inequality, and then what's he go to? Not inequality, but lower income. So ask yourself this, we can all agree lower income is bad. You'd like more. You're going to be healthier if you have more. Let's say we reduced inequality by bringing down the top and left the bottom where they are. Would their health improve? What do you think? Would people get healthier because they have the same income, but other people around them are less wealthy? Is this a tough one? Or are you just hesitant to speak out? What do you think? You, sir, with the red.
No.
Good. Just want to make sure you're paying attention. And by the way, let's look at the data on life expectancy. This gives the life expectancy at various points. So 1970, the bottom half of earners were pretty close to the top half. There are two things to notice about this graph. Yes, it diverges. So the top half gained more life expectancy, but what's the other thing that's true? Bingo. Both are increasing. Who said that? Bingo. That's right. So they're doing better. Now, do you feel poor? I run into undergrads especially who feel poor. So let me ask you. Do you wish you had as nice a cell phone as your grandparents had? Do you wish you could fly from here to New York in under 6 hours for less than half a month's salary, the way the richest man in the United States in 1900, John D. Rockefeller, did? He couldn't. They didn't have such things. So let's look at the growth in real, not real world, but real as opposed to nominal, world GDP per capita, 1,000 to the present. Not much happening for about 8 centuries. 19th century, it goes up, and look at the 20th century. Now, that fact in the 19th century led a 19th century commentator. Oh, let me go here first. There's an economist named Brad DeLong, who I gather gave a talk here a few years ago. And he wrote, did anyone see his talk besides you? Anyone? He wrote an article called Cornucopia. And what he did was he looked at how many hours you had to work to make enough money to buy a certain item. And he looked at items in the Montgomery Ward catalog and then looked at the same item in 2000. So he looked in 1895 and 2000. So 6 volumes of this famous set of books, 21 hours in 1895, 0.6 hours in 2000. So the productivity multiple was 35. A 1-speed bicycle, 260 hours, that's a month, versus 7 hours, that's a day, and so on. And it goes down. The one thing that took longer is the silver teaspoon. But what he points out is interesting about that. Why did they want a silver teaspoon? Because they didn't want it to rust. In 2000, did you have to get silver to avoid rust? They're a lot cheaper kinds of teaspoons. So even there was an improvement. That fact of that incredible productivity led a famous 19th century commenter to say this. The first to show what man's activity can bring about, the bourgeoisie was the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades, et cetera, et cetera. Let me just hit to some bottom lines. The subjection of nature's forces to man machinery, the application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, the clearing of entire continents for cultivation, the canalization of rivers, the conjuring of entire populations out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? Now, there are 2 little hints in here about who said it. Bourgeoisie and social labor. Who do you think said it? This guy. Karl Marx, apparently imitating Napoleon Bonaparte there. Now, here's the thing. Karl Marx understated because he didn't hit the 20th century. Here's what Brad DeLong says in that same article. Karl Marx was dumbfounded at the pace of the economic transition he saw around him in the middle of the 19th century. Yet compared to the pace of economic growth in the 20th century, all other centuries, even the 19th century that so impressed Karl Marx, were standing still. And by the way, let me just say another couple of things about that. If you look at what you have, almost everyone, probably everyone in this audience has, you have more in some important ways than the richest man in America, John D. Rockefeller, had. He didn't have any version of this. He didn't have air conditioning. He didn't have something that would play music when he wanted it. And he didn't have penicillin. That one was pretty big. Calvin Coolidge's son was playing on the White House lawn. He was president in the early 1920s, was playing on the White House tennis courts, developed a blister, came inside, and died. With antibiotics, that wouldn't have happened. Pardon me. Now, someone who recognizes this is Piketty. Here's Piketty. The average per capita purchasing power in Britain and France in 1800 was about 1/10 of what it was in 2010. 1/10. So someone with 20 to 30 times the average income in 1800 would have lived no better than someone with 2 or 3 times the average income today. That gives you an idea of how much wealthier we are. By the way, even Piketty slips, because later on in the same book, he says this, and the poor half of the population are as poor today as they were in the past, with barely 5% of total wealth, just as in 1910. No. He took a percent of a much larger number and forgot that it was a much larger number. That's pretty basic, and yet he makes that mistake. Now, I said I would talk about the role of earners in the income distribution. We sometimes have this stereotype that all families are kind of the same. And so in a family at the bottom, you have people working. In families at the top, you have people working. Maybe it's one person, maybe it's two people, but they don't look that different. That stereotype is badly wrong. Here are the data. This is from the Census Bureau 2015, and we could look at all the numbers on top, but I want you to look at the ones I put in bold. The first income quintile is the bottom one. The number of workers per household was less than 1, 0.4. The fifth quintile is the top one. The number of workers per household is 2.0, 5 times as many as the number in the bottom. So this just reinforces the point I made earlier. Remember I talked about how to get rich, get married, and both of you work. Very hard to be poor if both of you are working. There's also an important role of age in explaining wealth inequality. Oops, let me just say something before I get there. Think about, I hope you didn't look at the slide too much. Think about what you'd expect. You're young, most of you. You start out, you don't have much wealth. You start making wealth. You start saving. At some point, you buy a house, unless you live in San Francisco, and then it's impossible. And which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. And then you save, and your house grows in value, and your savings grow. Albert Einstein apparently was once asked, what's the most powerful force in nature? He answered, compound interest. By the way, I can't find that that's literally true, but it's a great story. If you find it on the web, everyone's saying it, but I don't know. But anyway, it's a great story. And even if he didn't say it, he should have. So let's look at the role of age in wealth distribution. So the data, including equity in the home, and that's what I want to look at because that is wealth after all, is blue. So notice people under 35 years old have very little. Then it goes up, up, up. I'm actually right at the peak. I'm 66, and that's tracking. I'm better off than I was when I was between 60 and 65. And this just basically, so this is a huge reason for wealth inequality, simply age and compounding. So if you had everyone who was 20 making the same income as every other person 20, everyone who's 30 making the same income as everyone else who's 30, everyone who's 40 making the same income as everyone else who's 40, you would have huge wealth inequality. Now, I mentioned earlier the difference in the two ways of getting wealth, the McCullough way and the LBJ way. When I read economists who are talking a lot about wealth and income inequality, they don't pay careful attention to that difference. So it's difficult to know whether they think that difference really matters. Most of them tend to look just at aggregate data on income and wealth and not ask how people got it. But one thing we do know is that at least some economists, including some who've written about it at length, don't seem to care much about the distinction between various ways of getting income. So they advocate higher taxes on the wealthy without asking, how did the wealthy get their wealth? So to them, the person who got his $1 million a year income from a government subsidy for a football stadium is the same as the guy who made $1 million by introducing a better pizza that people wanted to buy. So typical of those economists is economist Joseph Stiglitz, former chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors under Clinton. Here's what he said in his textbook. Consider again a simple economy with two individuals, Robinson Crusoe and Friday. Assume initially Robinson Crusoe has 10 oranges, while Friday has only 2. This seems inequitable. By the way, inequitable and unequal aren't the same. Inequitable means unjust, unfair. He says it seems. Let's continue. Assume, therefore, we play the role of government and attempt to transfer 4 oranges from Robinson Crusoe to Friday, but in the process, 1 orange gets lost. In economics, we call that orange that gets lost deadweight loss. Hence, Robinson Crusoe ends up with 6 oranges and Friday with 5. We eliminated most of the inequity, but in the process, the total number of oranges available is diminished. Notice what he did. He said it seems inequitable, and then 2 sentences later, it is inequitable. We eliminated most of the inequity. Wait a minute, how'd that happen? All he did was look at what they had. He never asked how they got it. So to him, apparently, it doesn't care. Now, Piketty, by contrast, to his credit, in various parts of the book, does recognize the difference between making a fortune and grabbing a fortune. In that respect, he's one up on Joe Stiglitz. That's the good news. The bad news is that he throws up his hands at ever being able to distinguish empirically between the two. Here's what he says. In any case, the courts cannot resolve every case of ill-gotten gains or unjustified wealth. A tax on capital would be a less blunt and more systematic instrument for dealing with the question. Really? A tax on capital, no matter how you got your wealth, is less blunt? It sounds incredibly blunt to me. Now, imagine you have 2 buttons. Button A, you push. You reduce inequality, but you get slower growth. I'll say why in a minute. And people rise slowly. Button B, you push. You increase inequality. You get higher growth. The poor rise quickly, and the wealthy rise even more quickly. That's why it's higher inequality. I want to ask you in a minute which button you'd push, but I want to fill in some of the reasoning for that. First of all, by the way, Piketty makes clear in his book, he would push button A. He says the optimal income tax rate in richer countries is probably above 80%. So he wants the government for rich people to get 4/5 of every additional dollar they make. He would push that button. By the way, he also says that rate on incomes between $500,000 and $1 million, quote, will not bring the government much in the way of revenue. So he's not doing it for revenue. He's doing it to get equality. But the problem is incentives matter. If the government taxes people's income and wealth highly, they have less incentive to get that income and wealth. So if the government taxes wealth, and he advocates a tax on wealth, an annual tax on wealth, then there's less incentive to produce wealth, to create wealth. Let's translate that to the economy. If people have less incentive to invest, there's less capital. With less capital, there's less capital per worker. With less capital per worker, the marginal product of labor is lower, and therefore real wages are lower. So this is a formula for making people worse off than otherwise. Not necessarily worse off than they were, because there'll be some growth, but worse off than they would be if you hadn't done that. And by the way, someone who recognizes that is Robert Solow, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in the early 1980s for his pioneering work on economic growth. He did a very positive review of Piketty in the magazine The New Republic. And here's what he said. I'm going to focus on the highlighted part because it's a long quote. Would you rather live in a society in which the real wage was rising rapidly but the labor share was falling, or one in which the real wage was stagnating along with productivity, so the labor share was unchanging? The first is surely better on narrowly economic grounds. You eat your wage, not your share of national income. He's basically pointing out what I pointed out. You push button A and you get more equality, less inequality, but people are worse off. You push button B, you allow people to keep the capital they invest in, real wages grow, and people are better off. So even though he would push button A, he recognizes that people would be worse off if he did so. And so he must have other reasons. I'll get into that in a few minutes. So I'm ready to, and let me just remind you what he means when he says you eat your wage, not your share. You actually get your real income, and even if your share rises, if it's a share of a much smaller number, your overall real wage is lower. That's what he's pointing out. So remember, button A, less inequality, more equality, but people are worse off. Button B, more inequality, but people are better off. So let me ask you, who would push button A? Who would push button B? I feel like ending here because my work is done. But I'm not gonna, because I want to give you total value for your money. I think I got another 8 minutes to go. Well, I did, the last time I gave this, I had someone who pushed button A. And so I had this great next slide, but I'll show you anyway. Because if you would push button A, I want to talk about another kind of inequality. Life expectancy by gender. Those damn women, they live longer than us, 5 years longer. And by the way, part of enjoying life is A, being alive. And so if you did push button A, here was where I was gonna go, but guess what? I saved a minute. I don't need to go there. I'll skip that slide. Now, what are the objections to inequality? It's amazing. In Piketty's book, and I read through it very carefully, he never really says what's wrong with it. So here are the 5 I could think of, and I want to deal with each one. Much of the inequality in wealth is due to people using government to make themselves better off at the expense of others. I'm going to talk about that. People who are not in the top fifth have very little. Those with great wealth or high incomes use their wealth to dominate those with little wealth and low incomes. Those with great wealth have a disproportionate influence in the political system, an influence that they use to rig the system against those in the bottom end. And those at or near the bottom feel bad when they see people with great wealth. Let's look at each of those. The first one, much of the inequality in wealth is due to people using government to make themselves better off at the expense of others. It's true. I talked about LBJ, and if it were just one story, it wouldn't matter. But guess what? It's not one story. Remember I mentioned housing, and you looking at question? Oh, okay. Remember I mentioned housing in California? I own a house in California. I bought it for $174,000 30 years ago. It's worth 5 times that now. And granted, I put $150,000 into it, but still, that's a nice return. There are families moving out of California because they can't afford that. And there's a reason why those housing prices are high. It's not magic. You know what it is? Governments won't let them build. It is very hard to get permission to build in California. And 2 economists, one at Edward Glaser at Harvard and Joseph Giorco at Wharton, showed that the problem was not the high prices in California and in the Northeast United States are not due to scarcity of land. They're due to scarcity of building permits. You know, they had a very clever methodology for showing that. So when I go to various meetings and I argue that we should allow people to build, I'm alone. There's the developer and me, and all my neighbors on the other side. So yeah, people in my income category, because I'm relatively wealthy, I did all those rules about saving. They are using their influence. But are you going to improve that by taxing them? I don't think so. It's got to be a more fundamental change. So that's the first one. Oh, and by the way, one economist who looked at Piketty's work pointed at this guy named Wrongley, this very, very bright graduate student. Is capital income displacing labor income? Because that's what Piketty was saying. Only if you count housing. Surging house prices are almost entirely responsible for growing returns on capital, which means that rising house prices may be chiefly responsible for rising inequality. As a result, Wrongley concludes Piketty should have titled his book, housing in the 21st century. That's the story in America. So I say, don't tax them more, just let people build. How about the second one? People who are not in the top fifth have very little. We've already talked about that. People who are not in the top fifth have a lot. We've looked at those data. How about the third one? Domination by the rich. Do the wealthy dominate the non-wealthy? Here's what my friend at Hoover, John Cochran, said. Look at Versailles. Nobody, not even Bill Gates, lives like Marie Antoinette. And nobody in the US lives like her peasants. In 1960, Mao Zedong waved his hand and 20 million died. In 1935, Joseph Stalin did the same. By the way, neither reported a lot of income to tax authorities for economists to measure inequality. Their income was low. They just had a huge amount of power that they used to dominate. We don't have anything like that today. And in this country. We have it in North Korea, but that's a whole separate story. How about the disproportionate influence of the rich in the political system? Pardon me. There are two parts to that. One is there was a lot of talk about campaign spending. The rich use their wealth to spend on campaigns and determine outcomes of elections. Well, you know what? We had an election recently. Didn't go the way a lot of people thought it would go. Let's look at some data. Clinton campaign. Total amount raised and spent, $1.3 billion. Trump campaign. Total amount raised and spent, $0.8 billion, 60% as much. Who won? Trump. So there's not just this tight relationship between campaign spending and winning elections. That ain't kind of alarm or something that we have to worry about?
It's just 20 out.
Oh, okay. So there is one thing, though, people worry about. These two scholars at Princeton found the following. In the United States, and by the way, their data are impeccable, so I'm not going to take issue with their data. I'm going to take issue with something else. In the United States, our findings indicate the majority does not rule, at least not in the causal sense of actually determining policy outcomes. When a majority of citizens disagrees with economic elites and or with organized interests, pardon me, they generally lose. Now that sounds bad. But notice what they say, and they think it's bad. But notice what they say. They say disagrees with economic elites. They're talking about the preferences. When in their data, they're measuring the preferences of the economic elites. And they do that by looking at polling data on what they favor. That doesn't mean that the system favors the interests of the economic elites. The economic interests, it means it favors their preferences. So let's look at one issue where the economic elites differ dramatically from the average voter, and that is on free trade. The economic elites generally are very pro-free trade. The average voter is less pro-free trade. Most free trade helps disproportionately lower income people as a percent of their income. So you look at all the clothing we can now buy from China, poor people spend a much, much, much higher percent of their budget on clothing than rich people. So when the economic elites are pushing as they did for free trade, the people who gain disproportionately are the poor. And in fact, I think you can't argue ethically that it's always right for the political system to reflect the will of the voters. The voters can do some very bad things. Take one of the worst elections in the 20th century. The last election that could be called realistically an open election in Germany in 1933, where Hitler got 44% of the vote, and the next highest person got 18%. Do we like those results? I don't think so. So there's no automaticity to the majority wanting good things. So the relevant question is whether those at the top tend to rig the system against those at the bottom. As I've said, to some extent they do with housing, for example, which I talked about in California. So go after that. Don't go after wealth per se. And finally, the fifth item I mentioned was those at or near the bottom feel bad when they see people with great wealth. I'm tempted to say boo-hoo, but let me say a little more. If you look at why people object to inequality, it's not someone who's making $30,000 a year getting pissed off at this hedge fund guy who just bought his next jet. It's the guy upset because his brother-in-law got a nicer car. That's the kind of inequality people actually get very enraged about. And none of these policies are going to do anything about that. The people around you, some of them are always going to have somewhat nicer stuff. So although I don't think economic inequality of wealth or income is a problem per se, I do think lack of economic freedom is a problem. And also some reductions in freedom have actually increased economic inequality. So it makes sense to reduce or abolish, pardon me, government regulations that have both reduced economic freedom and increased economic inequality. There's a long list of such regulations. I'll mention 4. Occupational licensing, the minimum wage law, laws against drugs, and restrictions on immigration. And I want to say a little about each. Oops. Occupational licensing. There are 800 occupations in the United States in which you need a license somewhere in the United States to practice. And those laws make it very hard for people to get on that first rung of the economic ladder. It's not just doctors and lawyers who require licenses. It's cornrow braiders in some states who have to take these complicated courses on dealing with chemicals, even though in cornrow braiding, they don't use chemicals. And by the way, the White House under Obama, to its credit, put out a great report on this last year, talking about how we should get rid of some of this stuff and make it easier for people to get jobs. That would help people who are closer to the bottom. The minimum wage law. The minimum wage does not guarantee that you'll get a wage. It guarantees that if you have a job, you'll get a wage, but it's precisely the fact of that guarantee that often prevents you from getting a job. It prices out the least skilled workers and therefore makes it harder for those workers to rise. Laws against drugs. We often hear about the top 1%. I'd like us to hear a lot more about the bottom 1%. You know where the bottom 1% are? They're in prison. If you look at the average income of people in prison, I've looked at the data, a typical wage rate is $1 an hour. And there are approximately 2 million people in prison. A large percent of them, not a majority, but a large percent are there because of the drug laws. I think we should get rid of all those drug laws and let those people out. To his credit, Obama let about 1,000 of them out. He should have let 100,000 out. I don't have time in this talk to say why I think the drug war and the drug laws are such a bad idea. I can tell you that has nothing to do with my own personal habits. I'm about as uncool as you can imagine. And it has nothing to do with what my plans would be if it were illegal. It has to do with a lot of thinking I've done about the economics of illegal markets, and I've thought about this and written about this over the last 40 years. Actually, I can't promise that. I mean, if marijuana were made totally legal, I'd probably try it. And finally, immigration laws. So far, I've talked mainly about economic inequality within the country. I talked a bit about the world, but there's a much bigger inequality, and that is in the world. All but the poorest 10% of people in America, for example, are richer than all but the richest 10% of people in India. And I want to show you this slide. A friend of mine, an economist friend, just got over to India where he's on sabbatical for a few months, and he put this picture on Facebook 2 days ago. This is life in India for a lot of people. It sucks. What can we do about it? We can liberalize our laws on immigration and let more of those people in. Now, those people would be tremendously better off. When people come from those poor countries, their wages increase to 5 to 10 times what they were there. And by the way, they send some of them back and help the people who are back home. A friend of mine, an economist friend, said, Henderson, you're arguing wrong. You're arguing from a humanitarian basis. You should argue from a self-interest basis. I'm going to hit both. I've argued from the humanitarian basis. The self-interest basis is this. For you, Almost everyone in this room would be better off if we allowed more immigration. Wouldn't you love to have a servant? I sure would. And that servant would be way better off. Now, allowing more immigrants might lead you to have, you might be worried about that. They might vote away the system. I come from Canada, eh? And if someone had told me I could never vote, I'd say, I'm in. I haven't affected one election yet, and I don't need to vote. And if someone said I'm never going to be allowed to go on welfare when I come into this country, I'd say I'm in. It's much better than spending all the money I spend on lawyers. So we could have a residency requirement that would take care of the welfare issue and take care of the voting issue. So let me summarize. Oops. Empirically, income inequality and wealth inequality are problems only to the extent that they result from restrictions on people's freedom. Over the long run, economic freedom will make virtually everyone better off, as it has in the past. We saw those data. Even those who are less confident than I, though, about the effects of economic freedom should at least get their story straight. Most of the problems alleged to be due to higher inequality, at least the problems that are real problems, not things like envy, are not due to higher inequality, but instead are due to low income. So my final comment is, let's focus on that and forget about inequality. Thank you. Now we have time for Q&A, right? Before we do, how long do we have for Q&A?
Oh, let's say 20, 25 minutes.
Okay, let me give my 3-minute little pep talk that I give to undergrads. Okay? A lot of you had heard of Milton Friedman. I knocked on his door when I was 19, and he gave me some advice, some of which I took. So he used, in letters, we go right back and forth. He used to call himself my Dutch uncle. So this is Uncle David. So a lot of you are thinking, or you will think in the next couple of years, what do you want to do next? And if you're good in school, a very natural thing you will conclude is, and I've seen this, talk to young people, I want to go to graduate school, or I want to go to law school, or I want to get an MBA. Now, all of those could be good choices, and all of them could be really bad choices. It depends on how much you think it through and what you want to do. Because here's the problem. Let's say you do one of those things, and I've met many lawyers in this situation, and you get out, and now you're not in your early 20s, you're in your late 20s, and then you want to have a family maybe, and then you get into your early 30s, and you decide you hate it. And you're in your early 30s, and it's a lot harder to adjust than it would have been when you were 22. So I'm not saying don't do it. By the way, I persuaded my nephew not to do it, and he didn't go to law school because he couldn't tell me why he wanted to. I said, why do you want to? He couldn't come up with a sentence. And he's not a dumb guy. He now is, at age 40, a millionaire because he started his own firm. He didn't go to law school. Now, that's one sample point, but the point is, you're better off thinking hard about what you want to do. Now, you might say, I don't know what I want to do. That happens a lot with 22-year-olds. Think hard about that. Going to graduate school, law school, MBA for 2 to 6 years, that's intensive. That took a lot of time. Put 6 months, 9 months, a year into thinking hard, into trying things. You might end up thinking, I want to be a lawyer. By the way, if you look at the data, I don't think you'll end up thinking that. It's scary how the web, it's not scary to me as a consumer. I'm going to redo a will, and this time I'm not even going to use a lawyer. We'll see. But the last time I used a lawyer, we paid $3,000, and I think I can do better. So you might decide you want to do one of those things, but then decide thinking about it, not just falling into it. That's my little Uncle David speech. Okay.
Corey is in charge of who gets to ask questions. I think we have the mic. Jada, she has it. So get her attention. Or take a few questions.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for coming tonight.
Oh, you're welcome. What's your name?
My name's Joe.
Hi.
I'm a senior here. So yeah. So we were talking about. We started out with this story about the chainsaw innovator who. So thinking about the taxation and the level of taxation on top incomes. It's difficult for me to imagine an innovator like that actually being significantly discouraged by a higher marginal top or a higher top income bracket tax. Excuse me, I'm juggling that word.
Tax rate, right?
Yeah, tax bracket. Is there empirical evidence that backs up the idea that taxes on extremely high incomes stifle innovation?
Good question. I don't know the evidence. It's very hard to find because, see, if you look back at various times when we've had higher tax rates, we've also had less regulation. And so we don't know which factor matters. I do think it's implausible to think that someone looking at developing something, knowing he'll keep less than 20% of what he produces, will be as motivated as someone who thinks he will keep 60%.
Hello, my name is Shri.
Hi, Shri.
I'm an assistant professor teaching photography in the art department. So I'm really the outsider in the room, I guess. I have a quick question regarding, you presented a hypothetical 2 buttons like the A and B, and one will probably reduce the inequality versus the other one will probably add to progress. My question is there any data regarding if the condition is one or the other, which and how they affect the environment and the complete world, including the natural and other forces, besides the income and the only human lives per se?
Well, I think it goes back to the answer I gave Joe, that if you tax, if you discourage the accumulation of capital, you'll have less capital than otherwise, and therefore lower marginal product of workers. And so one big kind of gross piece of evidence is look at India versus United States. The amount of capital per worker is much, much, much higher here. Then.
It appears we're leaving a period of politically induced austerity to a politically induced capital formation period. In what ways, when the political environment encourages capital investment to benefit those that are in a lower status position?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. I didn't understand the premise. Like when you say the political...
A period of austerity is politically induced. In other words, from a Milton Friedman's perspective, I mean, there's hundreds of millions of board feet of lumber up in Canada. I mean, there's probably billions of tons of limestone that could be made into cement. I mean, they could have so many houses in the United States to make your beds fit. It's a political decision not to use the natural resources in order to solve your housing problem.
Right. Which I talked about, right? When actually, you came in late. You might not have heard me talk about it, but I talked to...
The lecture was a fungible good.
Yeah, I talked at length about how it's very hard to get a building permit in California, and that drives prices higher.
Right, that's an artificially induced constraint.
Right.
It's not an economic constraint. It's a political.
It's an economic constraint imposed by the political system. Right. Well, what's your question?
I'll say it again.
Can you say it more briefly?
I guess what I'm saying is austerity or prosperity is a political decision. Why was the decision made for us to be in a austere environment artificially?
Oh, I did talk about that. When you have homeowners in my position whose houses are worth 3 times what they pay for them, they become a very strong lobby, and they're worth so much more because of that political restriction. They become a very powerful lobby to prevent people from building. As I say, when I go to meetings and I'm speaking in favor of allowing developers to develop housing, there are typically the developer and me on one side and my neighbors on the other.
Are you implying about environmental issues also, or is that?
I mean, it's just, let's put it this way. How many billion cubic other resource you can possibly imagine that's in superabundant supply naturally? The political system has basically decided that we're going to live in a period of artificial austerity that really isn't based on economics, it's just a political.
Right, and I granted that point.
We're living in dire austerity for 10 years. It's just preposterous. I mean, it was a political decision. It wasn't an economic decision.
Right, right. Back there?
I can try speaking without.
We'd like to get it recorded, if you don't mind. So, if Tori, we're going to have a video of this.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Hi, I'm Rasha
Hi.
from
What's
Political
your name?
Science.
What's your name?
Rasha.
Hi.
Okay, yeah. I'm from Political Science. A lot of people call me Rasha, so that's
Rasha.
okay too. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So my
Rasha.
question is regarding, as you mentioned during the presentation, about the immigration restrictions or something.
Yeah.
So, having background from political science, I'm just wondering, like, how do you see, like, President Trump policies towards that, whether, or in terms
Yeah.
of inequality? Do you think so? Will there any way it will help reduce inequality? Are you very optimistic about it? Or also from the immigration perspective too?
No, I'm not optimistic. Now that he's president, I'm not optimistic at all about that. There's some other things I like, but I don't like that. I don't think that's good. I'm optimistic about inequality diminishing, because if you look at the data, it's been diminishing. I showed that elephant graph. It's been diminishing even with those restrictions on immigration. But I'm not optimistic. I think we're going to have tighter immigration restrictions than we've had recently. But I still think that it's worth arguing about. It's still worth me advocating it, even if I think I'm going to lose in the short run. Over there.
Hey there. I'm
Hi. What's your
Daniel
name?
Kane. Daniel Kane. I'm in
Hi.
the grad. I'm a grad student in the econ department here.
Ah.
And I was just curious if the income tax were redistributed such that the income tax across all levels was 0, but the tax was then redistributed so that people who pay what they pay right now in taxes is essentially the same. So like across consumer goods and services, switch the income tax to just taxes on goods and services.
A consumption tax?
Consumption taxes.
Okay.
Yeah. So in this hypothetical scenario, do you think that people's incentives to earn would be changed at all? Changing the nature of the tax?
Oh, yeah, because if you did it that way, you would get rid of the whole graduated structure where the top tax rate now at the federal level is about 43%. So that would, but by the way, if you did it, you'd have a huge problem in the short run because a whole lot of low-income people are getting the earned income tax credit. That would be gone. So you'd really want to look at that carefully before making a massive shift. And then her, and then that person back there.
Okay, so you had the section regulations that make inequality higher, make people worse off. Why do you believe laws that restrict drugs make people, make people more worse off? And you said you touched base on it briefly, but I would like to hear more about your idea on that.
Because they're in prison, right? So that's pretty bad. I've looked at the wage rates of people in prison. A typical number is $1 an hour. If they were not in prison, they could make $6 an hour if we didn't have a minimum wage, or $12 an hour. So they'd be massively better off. And it's not just your hourly wage. Imagine you could have the hourly wage you make, but you either get to be outside or in prison. Which would you choose? So the difference in their wage rate understates how badly off they are. I have a friend who got out of prison a few years ago, and it's convinced me I want to do my taxes really honestly, because I do not want to go there. Prison is bad. And so, but I think I can say a little more about the drug war, if that's what you're asking. A lot of people think the problem with drugs is with drugs, but most of the problems people have with drugs are not with drugs, but with the drug laws. Think about the crime think about the high prices of drugs. That results from the fact that the drug war, the laws against drugs, make drug production and distribution very risky, and they need to be compensated for that risk. Then look at the fact that because the price is so high, they find themselves just spending their time trying to find money for the drug and not having regular jobs, or they even steal. Well, then there's another problem due to the high prices, due to the drug laws. Think about the fact that you can't always know what you get when you buy an illegal drug. You can't know the purity, the quality. Why? Because it's illegal, it's very hard to advertise and establish a brand name. You wouldn't want to try advertising, come down here where everyone knows and buy my really safe drug. So the way I've put it when I've talked to my classes about this, think of two goods that leave Colombia that both start with a C: cocaine and coffee. What if the government made coffee illegal and had laws against it as tight, as tough as laws against cocaine? Would you be able to buy coffee? Yes. Where would you buy it? Was that you? No. You'd buy it in a back alley somewhere, right? You wouldn't go to Starbucks. What would the price be compared to now? Much higher. Would there be gang wars between coffee producers? Yes. So you think about most of the problems, not all the problems. I'll mention the one that doesn't go away. But most of the problems we have with drugs are not due to drugs, they're due to the drug war. The one problem we have is a lot of people don't want you to have it, right? It is the law of demand says at a higher price, you'll consume less, you'll buy less. I believe in the law of demand. So I do think if drugs were legalized, drug usage would go up. Now that doesn't bother me, because then even then when people abuse, the main people they're harming is themselves. Now a lot of the harm due to the drug war is on innocent parties not even involved. And so I think it's a much preferable situation. And by the way, the demand for drugs does appear to be highly inelastic. So if you look at Portugal, where they decriminalized a lot of drugs, usage didn't go up that much. It was amazing to me. As an economist, I was surprised by that. Does that answer you? Okay. Oh, this guy with glasses had one before you, but I don't know.
I had the same question. I want you to elaborate on drugs.
Oh, okay.
My name's Colin. I'm a freshman
Hi, Colin.
here in the Econ department. You talked about some of the problems with a higher minimum wage, just with finding jobs. So would you advocate for not having a minimum wage at all, or just one that is less?
Having no minimum wage at all. And I'll tell you, let me give you some examples. There probably would be jobs that would exist as a summer intern if an employer could pay you $3 an hour. So employers have to pay you $7.25 an hour, or they have to pay you nothing. That is weird. Don't let me, you can pay more than $7.25 an hour, or you can pay zero, but don't let me catch you paying between $0 and $7.25. Now that is strange. And so one of the trade-offs is jobs that pay more, the employer has less incentive to put time into the employee to train him, because that's time lost in other ways. And so there'd be more training. So jobs might look more dead end in the short run, but they'd be less dead end in the longer run if you had people allowed to be paid lower wages.
Okay, my name is Jehu.
Yeah, hi.
So I'm coming from a part of the world that is quite different from the United States.
Which part?
I'm coming from West Africa.
Okay. Which
in
country?
Ivory Coast, in Ivory Coast.
Okay.
So in my country, people will have a wage that is way less than in the US. However, if you look at what they can buy with their wage, it really differs from what we have in the US.
Right.
And my question is that a fair statement for someone to say that if you make 30,000 in Kansas, you are in the top 5% of the world? Because a family in Kansas who make 30,000, they will never get out of Kansas.
Right.
And maybe they are under debt, they are under student loans and all those type of things. And it's not very relevant for them.
Okay.
Now, the second question.
Oh, can I answer that one?
Okay. I have two questions. But
Okay. So you're pointing out a problem with those data. What they used to come up with those data I showed you was exchange rates. What you're pointing to is what we call purchasing power parity. You want to look at what the money actually buys. And you're absolutely right. If you look at poor countries and rich countries like us, and you adjust, you have exchange rate and the difference is here, purchasing power parity, the difference is here, but it's still a huge difference. So you'll get a haircut cheaper. You'll get housing cheaper. You get lots of things cheaper, but it's still, they're still doing way worse than us. And by the way, one measure is, which way are people moving? They want to come here. Your second question.
Now, my second question is the following. So you basically proved us that we are probably better off than Rockefeller now, because we have a phone, we have a computer.
In certain ways, yes.
In certain ways.
Very important ways.
In certain very important ways.
Right.
And from what you've demonstrated, it looks a little bit like the question of economic inequality looks more like a philosophical question than a purely economical question, because the human nature, I guess, will never say that we have enough.
Right. Absolutely.
So how can we address that in our society to what people to say, hey, the problem is probably not the income inequality, the problem is our nature? Do you think it's a philosophical question, the economic inequality that we face?
Yeah, I think it's a philosophical question. And I did talk about the philosophical question a little when I said that the difference between the two people, LBJ and McCullough, was that one of them relied on people voluntarily transacting. And so there was a philosophical part of that. I don't think the fact that people want more and more is a problem. I guarantee that almost everyone in this room will want more 10 years from now, and I don't see it as a problem. And if you see it as a problem, then ask yourself this: what if someone proposed you give up all the income growth you've had in the last 10 years? Come up and sign up with me at the end of this talk and see how many people come up. Right? We get used to what we have. So this thing back in the early 90s was a luxury, and then almost every income category, virtually every income category, was able to buy it, and now it's thought of as a necessity. And would I rather that people not be doing this as they're walking along the street? Yeah, I would, but I don't want to force them. And I just don't see, that it's just that is humans. We want more. If we get wealthier, we're going to want to travel. If we get wealthier, we're going to want nicer houses, nicer food. By the way, talk about nicer. You should have lived in this, well, I shouldn't comment on people's ages. Maybe you remember this, lady. I don't know. What coffee was like in this country 30 years ago. Yuck, right? And coffee is fantastic, right? Coffee is fantastic now. So just so many things have gotten better. And they'll probably get better. And I don't see it as a problem, is what I'm saying.
We are going to allow one more question, but the good news is, and I think we'll get to Kate, the good news is anyone else that has questions for David, we're going to have the reception at Wahoo after this. All are welcome. Just come see one of the officers. We'll get you a ticket to get in there, and we're going to have barbecue there. It'll be pretty great. So we hope to see some of you out there, but we'll get to one last question.
Simplify, Kate.
So I hope this question is pretty straightforward, but so you made the interesting point you made at the end was that we should focus on income and not on inequality.
Right.
And so with manufacturing workers in places like China or Bangladesh that are very poorly paid, what would increasing their wage, what effect would that have on global production?
It would depend on why the wage increased. There's this little rule in economics, never reason from a price change. So never say what would happen if the wage went up, because something happened to make the wage go up. And we want to look at that. So what if, for example, the government of China decreed that wages go up? Many of them, some of them would be better off and some of them would be worse off. The ones better off are the ones who keep their jobs and earn the higher wages. The ones worse off are the ones who lose their jobs. Overall productivity would be lower. So that's what I would say there. However, the history of these things is that as they acquire skills and as they acquire more capital in those countries, their marginal product goes up, and that's why their wage goes up. And so what we've seen is actually migration of, I shouldn't say migration because that means people moving. We've seen a shift in where some of these goods are produced. So when I was a kid, like a little kid, made in Japan meant it was this cheap thing because Japan's wages were so low. Japan's wages are roughly comparable to ours now as their productivity has grown. So productivity shifted to South Korea, and then South Korea got wealthier in the 80s, and now productivity shifts, output shifts to India or China. And so that's kind of the story of economic progress. So if China continues at anything like its current rate of economic growth, we can imagine production shifting from there to, say, Bangladesh or places like that that are even poorer. Does that answer you? Okay.
While we still have an audience, we're going to have our Econ Club Vice President Paige make a little presentation.
Yes, we'd like to thank you so much.
Ah,
something to remember us by.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you got to see the back.
Oh, economists do it with models. Thank you very much.
Let's thank our speaker.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Hope to see everybody at Wahoo. Come get tickets. Got several. Oh, hey guys, another announcement. I'm getting some questions here. We have a sign-up sheet for our Econ Club listserv. So anybody that wants to know, our meetings are open to everybody on campus. So if you're interested in the types of talk